Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing about the game between the Sharks and the Wild, in which the Sharks managed to win 4-3 in regulation. Now, this game started off actually pretty well for the Sharks. They came into that first period, they got away with a 1-0 lead, and while the Sharks only actually had 2 shots in that period to the Wild's, I think they had 8, it didn't seem like it was really a dominated period by the Wild. I think it was mostly even. It's just that the Wild got more shots on net. In the second period, the Sharks began to get a bit more steam going. They put up 2 goals in that second period to the Wild's 1. Then in the third period, it was looking eerily similar to some of the previous games the Sharks played this season, where they gave up 2 goal leads in the third period to both the Hurricanes and the Ducks in consecutive games. The Sharks came in with a 3-1 lead, and the Wild were able to get 2 quick goals in the third period to tie it up. But it was Barclay Goodrow with the go-ahead goal with about 12 or so minutes to go in the third period, and that lead the Sharks managed to hold for the rest of the game. Scoring for the Wild, it was Parise with a power play goal. So this was the first power play goal the Sharks had given up in, I think, 9 games in a row. They had gone without giving a single one. Then for the Wild, also Spurgeon and Dumba, both defensemen, off 2 seeing eye shots, I guess you could call them. Scoring for the Sharks, 4 players getting their second goal of the year, which is a massive coincidence, which is Sorensen, Thornton, Suomela, and Barclay Goodrow. As I said, go-ahead goal. So I'd like to first talk about the third line, which tonight was Thornton, Sorensen, and Goodrow. All 3 of those players ended up with a goal, so that's obviously a massive sign that this was a strong night for the third line, and indeed it was. Marcus Sorensen played his best game of the season. Thornton seemed to be up to speed with the NHL, which is definitely a great sign, this being, I think, his 4th game back from this major injury, only 6th game this season. And so it would be a massive plus for the Sharks if Thornton actually gets back to speed. And this game is looking like that's exactly it. And Barclay Goodrow, a player who I wasn't really expecting to be that strong on this third line, actually had a pretty solid game for himself and got the game-winning goal. Now, I found it a bit interesting that in the third period, DeBoer actually pivoted away from this third line. He ended up putting Thornton with Pavelski and Kane on the second line, I guess you could call it, and he moved Donskoy to a third line with Suomela and Sorensen again, and then I assume Goodrow found himself on the 4th line, although Goodrow did get a shift later on in the game with Couture and Meyer, but that was mostly just for a more defensive option than Kevin Labanc, certainly. So hopefully that was just a small choice by DeBoer to try and hold the lead in the third period, and that if Hertl is still injured for the next game, Thornton remains with Sorensen and Goodrow. At least Thornton remains on the third line, because it was something that worked extremely well in this game, and it would be somewhat sad to see DeBoer split that group up. Next is Evander Kane, and he was someone who I was expecting to come into today and say that he was just being a bit disappointing. It was again a bit of a disappointing night by Kane, but he did get a couple of nice chances in this game, right? He blew past Matt Dumba for an opportunity that he just couldn't get past Devan Dubnyk. He had a nice tip that Dubnyk was able to save. And so it wasn't for a lack of chances that Kane just hasn't been able to generate anything. He's been a bit snake-bitten. He's been a bit unlucky, but I would like to see him get a bit more into the play. He's a physical guy, and I saw maybe 1 major hit in this game. I'd like to see him get a bit more involved, because that is when he plays his best hockey. Next is Burns and Karlsson. Burns, I thought, had a fantastic game. He ended up with 2 assists. His first assist on the Sorensen goal, which was absolutely fantastic, froze basically everybody on the Wild. Sorensen had the easy tap-in goal. And I thought Burns was also quite solid defensively in this game, so that's definitely a great sign for the San Jose Sharks. He is now the point-scoring leader for them with 18 points, and he's looking to be the guy on the back end for the San Jose Sharks, when a lot of people thought Erik Karlsson would contest in that regard. Speaking of Erik Karlsson, I thought Karlsson also had a solid game for himself. The points have yet to show up, but there are just, I say Burns has been the best defenseman for the Sharks, and it is true. Burns has been able to convert a lot of his offensive plays into goals, but when it comes to just the highest sort of level of play, Karlsson just does some moves, some passes, some stick handling maneuvers that are just so out of this world that you can definitely see why this was a player that was called one of the best the best defenseman in the NHL and one of the best players in the entire league just a couple seasons back. Just the plays he's able to pull out are just mind-blowing, really. And I thought Karlsson was also improved a lot defensively this game. No real major mistakes, I don't think. The couple of plays on the Parise goal, I think on the power play, he definitely could have played it better. Maybe could have skated up to Parise, but nothing extremely major, I guess you could say. So I think Karlsson is finally starting to get his defensive game up, as it's been a couple games in a row that it has been solid. Hopefully that can continue, and then eventually, with the amount of plays that Karlsson is actually able to produce, the points should be able to follow. Others I'd like to talk about. Suomela had an okay game for himself. Obviously, he did score, and then immediately after, I think it was like 5-10 seconds after, he got another fantastic chance. Other than that, though, he wasn't really a major factor. It was still nice to see him be able to get the goal and the chance, but I'd like to see, again, this was the reason why DeBoer actually scratched him, because he wasn't showing much consistency in the early parts of the season. I would like to see some more, consistent chances, not just one and done type of things, but, over the, 10 or so minutes that he actually gets per night, I'd like to see multiple opportunities, not high danger, not grade A necessarily, but still controlling, forechecking the puck type of plays. Joakim Ryan, I thought, he was a good player this game, but I thought what was most interesting is that Peter DeBoer actually played Joakim Ryan a decent amount in the third period. He actually ended up with a decent amount of ice time, so that was certainly a nice plus. Martin Jones had a pretty good game for himself. Again, the two shots by Spurgeon and Dumba, he couldn't have had the Spurgeon one. There was like 6 bodies in front, no chance to see. You could argue he could have had the Matt Dumba one, although that was a perfectly placed shot, so it's hard to say. Other than that, I thought Jones had a pretty okay game. It's one of those ones that, he did let in 3 goals, but it didn't really feel as though this was, a below average performance from Martin Jones. I thought he was quite solid. Other than that, Kevin Labanc ended up on the first line, I guess you could call it, with Meier and Couture. I thought Labanc did look a bit out of sync with the two. You could definitely tell that there was a lack of chemistry between Meier, Couture, and Labanc. A couple of times, especially in the first period, there were some plays that both Couture and Meier tried to pull off with Labanc, but if maybe Hurdle was there, Hurdle would have been in a certain position, Labanc was in a completely different position, so the passes went to nobody. So you could definitely see a bit of bumps, but Hurdle was a game time decision tonight, which makes me think that he should be on the road trip playing against the Stars or the Blues. Hopefully, again, head injuries, very unpredictable, but hopefully he'll be back by Thursday or Friday against the Stars or the Blues, at which point they can move Labanc down off of that top line. That wasn't really effective in this game, and it was good that the Sharks were able to get a ton of secondary scoring from their bottom 6, that they were able to still get the win, and 4 goals at that. Finally, the officiating for this game. I didn't necessarily have a major problem with the officiating at first. The first couple calls against the Sharks weren't the worst. Meier seemed to think that Brodin took a dive on his call. It's hard to say. The stick did get into the feet. Whether or not it was actually enough to take somebody down or if Brodin embellished it is a different question. But the real issue I had with the officiating was, one, the Vlasic unsportsmanlike conduct. Now, you could either blame the refs here and say, well, in such an intense point of the game, do you really call someone for something like that? The Sharks up by 1, 10 minutes to go in the third period. Do you make that kind of call? Or you can blame Vlasic, because I guess if the refs were forced to make a 2-minute penalty on number 44, you have to think that he was warned a couple of times to, stop talking, stop chirping, or something like that. So it is a bit of blame. You could blame the refs, you could blame you can blame Vlasic, but the real issue I had with the officiating was the fact that they didn't call a single penalty on the Minnesota Wild, and this wasn't a perfectly clean game from the Wild. Multiple times players like Suter, I think there was a hooking or a potential hooking penalty onto Joe Thornton. I think there was a potential hooking penalty onto a couple of other players as well, and so I think the Wild did get away with a lot of infractions, and the Wild are the second most penalized team minor penalty-wise in the entire league thus far this season, so it's hard to imagine that this was a team that took 0 minor penalties this game, but that is how it ended up shaking up. Luckily, the Sharks didn't need a power play goal to win it, but it definitely would have been nice to see the ref balance it out, especially after the third and the second calls, which were somewhat weak, I guess you could say. But that will do it. The Sharks have finished their homestand. They will conclude 2-1-1, which will get them 5 of a possible 8 points. Not the worst homestand that they could have. They will now head off on the road for just a couple of games as they go to Midwestern US through St. Louis, Missouri, as well as Dallas, Texas. And then they will be back in the Shark tank after that. Class dismissed.